everyone. Thanks for coming. Thanks for making it back from lunch. So in my talk today, I'll be making a number of observations about functional ceramics for the most part. And I'm sure that some of these observations have been made before, but my main aim today will be to emphasize connections with some core ideas of 20th century aesthetic philosophy and literary theory. So my talk is divided into two parts. A first shorter part on Potts's things, and the second on Potts's texts. I believe that these perspectives can lead to new ideas for ceramics criticism, by which I mean reading individual pots, and also ceramics medium analysis, by which I mean our understanding of the expressive mechanisms of ceramic materials and processes. I see these as complementary perspectives to things that we already know from art history and traditional art criticism. So this is in some ways a project to diversify the academic base of clay discourse. And on that topic of diversity, I'm sorry to say that in assembling visuals for this lecture, I wasn't really able to achieve as diverse a representation of makers and traditions as I would have liked. So if you have suggestions after the talk, I'd love to get your feedback about broadening my range of examples here. So Potts's things. Much of the philosopher Martin Heidegger's writing is concerned with developing an authentic and unmediated experience of things. In fact, he seems to suggest that responding sensitively and astutely to things is itself a kind of craft that requires earnest study and practice. So a lot of what I have to say today is really trying to follow along that sentiment. I'd like to introduce this part of the talk by reading a couple of quotes from essays by Heidegger. So they're referenced up there on this slide. There's The Origin of the Work of Art and The Thing. And these can both be found in English language versions in a translation by Albert Hofstadter in the book Poetry, Language, Thought. So reading first from The Origin of the Work of Art, and I'm taking this quote a little bit out of context, but mainly to serve the purposes that I have. The quote reads, and this is Heidegger talking about this painting, or there were actually a number of paintings like this by Van Gogh that depict basically just a pair of peasant's shoes. So the quote, "From the dark opening of the worn insides of the shoes, the toilsome tread of the worker stares forth. In the stiffly rugged heaviness of the shoes, there is the accumulated tenacity of her slow trudge through the far-spreading and ever-uniform furrows of the field swept by a raw wind. On the leather lie the dampness and richness of the soil. Under the sole slides the loneliness of the field path as evening falls. In the shoes vibrates the silent call of the earth, its quiet gift of the ripening grain, and its unexplained self-refusal in the fallow desolation of the wintry field." It's the end of the quote. And what I want to call attention to here is the way that the material aspects of the shoes, or even here really the represented material aspects of the painted shoes, invoke, honor, and make real the peasant's world. So this is a kind of term that Heidegger uses quite a bit. He mentions the worlding function of art, where we're trying to have material things, that is, works of art, that somehow are able to reify these kinds of aspects of lived experience. Moving on to a related quote from this other essay that I referenced there, just called The Thing. So there's a widely cited and studied set of passages from this essay where Heidegger is talking about a ceramic jug, so what I suppose in American English we would refer to as a ceramic pitcher. And what he's trying to get at is really to try to experience what is the essential thingness of this thing that we think of as a ceramic jug. So the quote reads, "The jug's jug character consists in the poured gift of the pouring out. The gift of the pouring out is drink for mortals. It quenches their thirst, it refreshes their leisure, it enlivens their conviviality. But the jug's gift is at times also given for consecration. If the pouring is for consecration, then it does not still a thirst. The outpouring is the libation poured out for the immortal gods. In the gift of the outpouring that is drink, mortals stay in their own way. In the gift of the outpouring that is a libation, the divinities stay in their own way, they who receive back the gift of giving as the gift of the donation. In the gift of the outpouring, mortals and divinities each dwell in their different ways. Earth and sky dwell in the gift of the outpouring. In the gift of the outpouring earth and sky, divinities and mortals dwell together all at once. These four, at one because of what they themselves are, belong together. Preceding everything that is present, they are enfolded into a single fourfold. So here what I want to call attention to is the way that Heidegger discusses how this single thing, so a functional thing here, a ceramic jug, has a sort of a functional polyvalence or polysemy, right? I mean, there are very different kinds of functions that this single thing can serve. And when you think of all of those different functions, some of them religious or ritualistic, and some of them very earthly, having to do with having fun at a party, let's say, that the existence of this thing really brings those different functions together and sort of points out that there's a sort of connection and coherence between them that you might not otherwise be able to appreciate without contemplating this kind of thing that invokes them all at once. And so in alternate places, in different places, Heidegger will talk about thinging as a verb, so the kind of thing that things do, and by that he really means this function of being able to invoke rather disparate aspects of the natural world or lived experience and kind of refer to them all at once. And in other places, he refers to what he calls the worlding function of art. And to me, they seem to be very similar concepts. And the way that I'd like to carry those concepts forward in the talk today is to think about, well, a thing that we want to respond to in craft objects or works of art is this kind of synthesizing metonymy. So this idea that a material thing can really invoke very intangible sorts of ideas, and that they pull together things that are difficult to pull together in the context of rational language. That there's really something special about functional art objects or fine art that can do this kind of can perform this kind of metonymy in a special way. So rather than go on about that too much in the abstract, I wanted to just look at a couple of actual objects and try to follow this idea that to me comes from Heidegger, talking about just responding to things in a very sensitive way and noting all the things that they evoke and somehow trying to build an understanding of the thing itself by way of the kinds of things that it invokes as our response. So the first piece, so the artist's name is up there. This is Takushi Takahara, and this is a sake pouring vessel. And I'd like to thank Bizen Gallery Aoyama for letting me use their images of this pot. So it's here, I have it in my hand. I wanted to show you some things about using it and holding it. And I'll just read a little bit from some notes that I've taken while using this. So they're kind of my functional notes, and then go on from there. So the form factor of the vessel really kind of makes you hold it opposite the spout. And it's a little bit funny that way in that you're holding it in this very cantilevered kind of fashion. So really, especially when you have a little bit of a liquid in it, when you're using it, this cantilevered way of holding it without a handle really makes the vessel feel heavier and more substantial than maybe it really is. It has these shaved vertical grooves on the sides that you can also see maybe better in the photograph there. And those shaved grooves combined with the angles around the pot, so that, at least for me, this is really a left-handed pot to hold. Because when you do that, the kind of indentations and the corners provide very convenient places for your fingers and for your fingers to sit and for your knuckles to bend. And a nice thing about holding it this way, since it does, to me, really suggest that this is the way that you're meant to hold the pouring vessel, if you have this room temperature piece of ceramics that you've taken off the shelf, and say you're using it to pour sake, then if you were filling it up with a cold sake, and the fill line might end up somewhere kind of in the middle of your hand. So you get a very strong touch impression that you have a cold line separating the way that the bottom of your palm feels as opposed to the top of your palm. And then it's a pot that pours pretty well, but it leaves a very dramatic, it's actually kind of dribbly. So it's a drippy kind of pour. So if you look at this view from the top, despite the fact that the form is really a very geometric and angular one, it has this kind of a cant or a twist towards the side, kind of coming towards a point, which is more like a curve. And if you've ever seen it, there's a building by Le Corbusier. It's called the Chapel of Notre Dame du Haut. It's in a place called Ronchamp. And the roof line of this chapel has a very similar kind of twist or cant coming towards a point. And what's even more of a resemblance, I would say, between this vessel and that building is if you look at the small windows that are cut out from the top of the form. So they're just those little square cutouts at the top, opening into the space inside. The Notre Dame du Haut has similar sorts of square or rectangular cutouts through the cement walls of the chapel. And those are really, if you look at them, they're not windows that give you a view on the outside, because some of them are really super high up on the wall. They're just little cutouts that let light into the chapel. So there's some very dramatic photographs taken from inside the chapel where you really see that. And they don't have any stained glass on them or any other sort of figuration. They're just openings. And I think in this particular case, the highness of these openings on the vessel wall, there's something to me that really establishes a kind of ground line that, that's the high point of the vessel, and then the business kind of happens down in the interior. And you can sort of imagine these shafts of light coming in through those square openings and shining down into the bottom of the inside. When you kind of take that perspective and combine it with the appearance of the actual material surface, so this very earthy kind of wood-fired stoneware, to me it really reminds me of things that I've read that were written by Robert Turner when he's talking about Canyon de Chelly and the influence of the sort of geology of the Southwest on a certain period of his work. There's a quote of Robert Turner quoted by Marcia Miro in the book Robert Turner, Shaping Silence, A Life in Clay. And I'd just like to read a short passage from that. It says, "When you touch the rock, the walls have very soft curves like curves in the body. And then there are sudden cuts, the result of events that occurred. Other canyons like Hovenweep, where rock formations were used by the Native Americans as habitations, and Chaco Canyon, which is not as deep as Canyon de Chelly, were impressive. Structures were built here using the formations of the rock and earth. Significant structures like Pueblo-type buildings and ceremonial structures and secret places for religious ceremonies. They are beautiful containers of space." So, those kinds of cuts or the movements, they invoke for me these shaved away pieces that you have on the side of the vessel. And then you also get an indication there that I also do think in this form of a thing like a kiva. So these would be these kind of ritualistic spaces that you have in the Pueblo civilizations, where often you would climb down into them through a ladder. And so they're sort of buried ceremonial spaces that were architectural sacred spaces. And so that sort of overall gestalt of the piece comes to me like that between the sort of similarities that we have to a building like the Notre Dame du Haut, or to these natural kinds of sacred spaces, either a canyon, and there's an interesting sort of thing that happens for me here, that when you look at the wood-fired surfaces of the pot, even though they're on the outside of the pot, I think the function of it and these sorts of all of the attention that you really have on what's going on in the interior of the vessel, those wall surfaces for me really get projected to the inside of the vessel, and makes you think more of this idea of a canyon. And in particular, in this functional sense, when you're holding the piece and you have this cold fill line running through the middle of your palm, that makes me think of if you've ever been hiking in canyons in the summer, it's super hot, but you come across a little box spring. So there's a cold swimming hole where the water is kind of down in the box canyon, and it's a place where you could go and have a quick swim. I'm somehow really reminded of that general kind of thing. So I'll come back to talking about that a little bit again later towards the end of the talk. Now, moving on to this other piece. So this is not a pouring vessel. This is a kind of a guinomi. And to me, when you first pick it up and try to navigate it, you find that it's an oddly shaped piece. It kind of is constructed, it looks like, by putting a set of petals together. And to me, I think if I try to find a reasonable way to put my hand around it, it's to me a right-handed piece. And it likes to have your fingers held around it like this. That was maybe sort of the most natural initial approach to it. So this this structure of the cup that suggests a certain hand position, like when you put your hand around it like that and then try to drink from it, it also suggests a certain surface that's meant to come to your mouth. But the lip of it is not simple at all. It really folds in and out and turns over. And so your lips actually kind of need to negotiate the edge every time you want to take a sip. Because of the overall form and the way that the surfaces are treated, when you drink from it, you really have this feeling like you're drinking from a leaf or a shell or some other found natural object. And in fact, the outside is really kind of a slip. It's not really vitrified. So it has a chalky sort of texture, much like a shell. whereas the inside is glazed for functionality, and so it has a much glassier, smoother finish. And so in fact, when you're taking a sip from it, if you think about that, your lower lip ends up on this very shell-like surface, whereas your upper lip on the inside ends up on a, let's say, a more pearly surface. So for me, the experience of drinking from it is very much like eating oysters. And overall, the piece has rather a solid heft, despite the fact that you have these very thin and kind of sharp edges. And the exterior surface that has these, let's see, where are we? Has these kinds of striations of painted slip. It really sort of invites you to rub it. And despite the fact that the surface is slippy and a little bit chalky, the clay body itself is really quite vitrified. So if you do rub that, especially if you have a little liquid in there, it rings. It has a very vitrified ring. There's this funny spiny pocket that I think you can see on the picture there, where there are a bunch of spines collected in here. And so there are other ways of holding it, where you could put your finger there, and then it gives you this other sort of weird handle that ends up making you hold it a little bit like a teacup. And in fact, if you really spend some time interacting with this piece, you find a number of other reasonable ways to pick it up. The foot ring at the bottom is really the thing that makes the piece feel most intentional and man-made. And the foot rings, or the base of the cup, is really rather heavy, but that's essential for making this a practical drinking vessel, that it sort of needs that in its weight distribution. But, so there are these various handholds that you find over time, but what I find most interesting about the piece is that every time you go to grab the piece, when your hand approaches the piece, there's a certain tentativeness, because you're aware of the fact that if you just grab it in a random way, you're going to have your fingers on all these sharp edges. And then when you bring it to your mouth, you're also very aware that there are these funny nooks and crannies in the rim. And so it's very different than using something like, say, a tumbler or a diner mug, where you can just grab it and take a swig. So in fact, if you just make a random approach to the vessel and just grab it and bring it to your mouth, you can end up in a situation where there's just no way to drink from it without dribbling. And so you have to pay quite a lot of attention just to drink from this thing. And so if you're trying to drink from it while doing something else, like surfing the web, you kind of can't. So the piece really has a strong agency that I think is not always there in other kinds of pots. And to me, that makes it a very interesting piece, especially when you consider all these things in combination with the kind of contrast of the petally, almost moth-like wing surface of things with the kind of spiny and sharp edges that you also have. And so it's definitely a piece that mediates. It's a vessel that mediates between the drinker and the drink. So, and so in talking about these two pieces, that's just kind of almost a stream of consciousness, free-form attempt to talk about the way that I at least respond to these pieces, and to think about what the aspects of their form are really expressing. But moving on into the second part of the talk, what I want to try to look for are some ideas about how to be a little bit more systematic or formal about the way that we talk about these expressive mechanisms of ceramic form. And so in approaching the second part, I keep a couple of things in mind. So I've been very influenced in my thinking by some things written by Suzanne Langer, who is another mid-century philosopher. So she in particular has a book called Feeling and Form, a theory of art developed from philosophy in a new key. And maybe the key thing to take away from that is the idea of art, so a piece of art or these sorts of ceramics that we're thinking about, that they mean through a kind of symbolism, right? There are aspects of them that stimulate you to think about other things, but what's maybe unique about them that makes them art, as opposed to an essay or some other piece of rational discourse, is that the way that the different components of a piece of art, or say a ceramic vessel, articulate a number of different things. So this is coming back a little bit to what Heidegger was talking about. But if you think about either of these two pieces that I just tried to talk about, different aspects of them invoke different things, and then having those different significations kind of brought together in one piece, your mind has to wrap around that and try to synthesize some whole picture out of that. And the sort of grammar of how those different pieces come together, the idea is that that's something that's very specific to material objects, to artworks, that has a very different kind of grammar than you would ever encounter in something like simply an essay or a piece of nonfiction. Okay, and then the other thing I wanted to mention was in a lot of what I'm thinking here, I'm really guided by some of the early writings of Susan Sontag. And so there's a long quote that appears here on the screen, but maybe I'll just emphasize the first line. She says in her essay Against Interpretation, "What would criticism look like that would serve the work of art, not usurp its place?" And so to me, that's really just encouragement when approaching criticism or medium analysis to start with the things themselves and to really try to articulate the aspects of form that jump out to you and to talk about them starting from there. To not necessarily try to reach back through the thing itself to the way that it was made. You know, we can always do our artistic biography. We can talk about process as a form of studio documentation, but there's a complementary aspect to thinking about ceramics, which really just starts from the thing itself and goes from there. Okay, so pots as texts. So the parallels that I want to draw here come from a single basic idea, which is that if you look at literary theory, and especially the analysis of poetry, as they've been developed, let's say, starting in the middle of the 20th century, a lot of the basic setup is this idea that when confronted with words, words always have two levels of meaning, right? There's a sort of literal layer of meaning, sort of the functional level of meaning of words, but then there's also floating above that somehow an imagistic or an indirect kind of meaning that words can have. And so it strikes me that especially when we're talking about functional ceramics, functional vessels, you also have this kind of duality where the parallel would be something like the functional aspect of a pot is kind of like the literal or plain meaning of words, and then the sort of way in which pieces like this stimulate to think about a broader set of ideas or really mean things to you, that this is somewhat like the imagistic level of meaning that you encounter in poetry and literature. And so on the literary side of the discussion, when one approaches the idea of formal analysis, so really looking at the details of word choice and word order to understand how words can invoke images, a kind of a first step is to really think about specific mechanisms that enable that. And these are often grouped under the heading of tropes. And so in this next part of the lecture here, what I want to do is just try to see if we just borrow some ideas about tropes from analysis of poetry and literature and see how well they apply to looking at pots. Maybe we learn something from that, and eventually, certainly, we want to go beyond that, but maybe that's an interesting place to start. So this first slide here is about synecdoche and metonymy, and so you may remember from somewhere back in grade school what these terms mean. Both of them have the general idea of using a part to represent a whole or some sort of reduction in representation. And so if, for example, if you look up synecdoche in Wikipedia, it gives you an example of when referring to soldiers, you talk about boots on the ground, right? So we're using a part, the boots, to try to represent the whole. Metonymy, at least in the context of discussing poetry, has a somewhat more specific meaning, where usually when you talk about metonymy, you're talking about a scheme of trying to represent something very incorporeal or intangible by reference to something very material. And so the classic example there is to refer to the heart when really what you're trying to do is talk about feelings. And so to just give a few examples of how that kind of thing maybe is found in ceramics, the examples that are on this slide. So there's a Bellarmine jug, which I'm sure many people have encountered, where there's the face of this a bishop or some other religious figure that's somehow associated in that era with prohibitions against alcohol, but then placing that on the surface of a jug which is meant to contain beer or something like that is a form of irony, a form of protest. But I think there's this synecdoche in representing this whole authoritarian view prohibiting alcohol by this one face, which is really a very schematic sort of face. In the line of something like metonymy, if you look at this Chino tea bowl that's in the middle image, you recognize, of course, that there's a little void spot towards the bottom where when the potter was glazing this pot, a finger went down into the region where the glaze was when it was being dipped and was left that way. So you have this finger mark, what in Japanese you would call yubiato, which then, as I think we all understand, comes later to sort of stand in for representing the role of the maker in making this. right? So it's a material thing, it's a little emission in the glaze, but it invokes this more intangible thing of sort of the fact that this object was made by a person in some very intentional way. And then on the jar that's all the way on the right, which is from some of the earliest kinds of wood firing that were done in Japan with natural ash glaze, I think when we look at those sorts of pots, especially those of us who are fans of wood firing, you see that how it's sort of been blasted by a bunch of ash, which then drips down and gives you all of these ash runs. And I think for many of this, we're drawn to those kinds of markings because they represent for us somehow the idea that this pot has sort of been to the edge of destruction. It's kind of looked over the rim of the volcano and survived that and sort of become sacred in that way. And so I do think there's a very broad kind of metonymy that we associate with the marks of wood firing that somehow have to do with this idea of a piece that has survived great trial and tribulation. So there's some very basic examples of how these kinds of rhetorical tropes that are maybe originally talked about in literary contexts certainly do also occur in ceramics. The next example I want to talk about is maybe a bit deeper in terms of actual analysis. And so here I was motivated by actually something that I first came across in reading Henry Louis Gates, Jr., who I'll mention again later on in the talk. But he was talking about something written originally by a fellow named Wimsatt, but where maybe that essay by Wimsatt is actually better explained in a subsequent essay by Anthony Easthope. And so the idea there is looking at rhyme schemes that these two critics had found in medieval poetry. And the idea is, or the claim is something like, if you look at certain kinds of rhyme, where these are end rhymes, if the rhymes occur between words that are the same parts of speech, so between two verbs at the end of lines, or between two nouns at the ends of lines, it's a very in-your-face kind of rhyme that tends to emphasize the sound of the words themselves. Whereas when you can accomplish a more subtle kind of rhyme, where the rhyming words are different parts of speech, so rhyming a noun with a verb or something like that, this calls attention to the actual meaning, especially of the second word. Right? So rhyming between same parts of speech will emphasize the sound, whereas rhyming between different parts of speech will emphasize meaning. And so I think in the context of ceramics, you can, I think you also see things like this, but where for different parts of speech, let's substitute different aspects of function. So in this false bottom bowl by Richard Devore, that's on the left part of the slide, the visual rhyme that I would call attention to is the sort of overall teardrop shape of the outer rim, which is of course echoed by the sort of cutout in this false rim that you find down in the bottom of the bowl. So there's that teardrop shape again. And so this would be an example where I would say that this is a visual rhyme between aspects of the form that play the same functional roles. They're both rims. And so to me, what it does is it really emphasizes this very elegant shape, or this teardrop shape, that kind of dominates the form of the bowl itself. Or on the right-hand side, we have this piece by Fukami Sueharu, which is a conical sort of bowl. And so here the visual rhyme I'm pointing to would be the overall conical shape of the outline of the bowl, but then the secondary cone that you have at the bottom just looking at the glaze line. And so this, again, I would say is a visual rhyme between two similar parts of speech, or two similar functional roles, in the sense that they both have to do with the overall outline, with the containing walls of the piece itself. So in contrast to that, I would offer these examples next. So on the left is a round vase by Tsujimura Shiro. And so here to provide an example of visual rhyme between very different functional aspects, there's the roundness of the mouth of the jar, of that abbreviated little lip that's at the top, and then the roundness of the marking that's on the side of the belly. And so that kind of marking, I think we can see from our experience with wood firing, it's what I think in Japanese would be called botamochi. So this would be formed by actually placing the opening of another vessel, like a bowl or something like that, against the body of the vase before it was fired, and then firing them together like that. And then, so that leaves something that's like a giant wadding mark. But often, in order to actually, after the firing, you'll often have to break off that secondary piece in order to expose that marking. But there's a very strong visual echo, I think, between the roundness of the rim, the simple roundness of the rim, and the roundness of that marking. And to me, since these are, one of these is a functional aspect, it's the mouth of the actual vase. The other one is a marking on the side. And so it, I think, focuses your attention on the meaning of these. And the meaning of that Bodamochi mark is, since it's a mark that sort of was made by having contact of another vessel, which is now gone, right? I think it has a very strong way of sort of invoking the absence of another vessel, and in some way even invoking the absence of the mouth of another vessel. This piece that's on the right, so this is attributed to the Moche civilization in the general area of Peru. So I love this piece. It has a very dynamic tension. So the visual rhyme I would call out here is the stirrup spout that you have on the left part of the piece has a vaguely elliptical sort of outline, but it's a falling ellipse, right? And then if you look at the crest of the wave that's on the right part of the piece, which I suppose is something like a handle for the piece if you were going to pour it, also it echoes that elliptical sort of shape, but also very much has a falling nature to it. So I think it really gives the overall form a kind of dynamic tension where you have something falling to the left and something falling to the right. And the form itself then is represented in the kind of the tension between those, sort of like the stalemate in a tug of war. And so here again is something where it's two very different functional aspects of the piece that give you the visual rhyme. And so it's not so much that your attention is really focused on ellipticalness or fallingness, but really just helps to contribute to the overall impression of the form. So in contrast to that, actually, one more example of these different parts of speech. So this stirrup bottle that's on the left part of the slide, this one attributed to the Chavin civilization, also in the general area of Peru. So here the visual rhyme for me is between the sort of, I guess that's a rhomboidal shape, or what is that? I forgot. It's vaguely triangular, but with a square bottom. So that's there in the stirrup. And then also if you look at the figure of the cat at the bottom, right, the outline that you trace between kind of what looked like its elbow, its shoulder, its hips, and then down to its foot, right? You get a strong echo of that form there. And so this is clearly, again, between a functional aspect, the stirrup neck of the piece, and then something decorative, this cat figure at the bottom. And rather than emphasizing that shape per se, right, I think that this rhyme, this visual rhyme, really helps to pull the form together, and I think especially also really helps with the use of space. I think if you just had a long, plain bottleneck going up to that height of the spout, and then all of the ornamentation at the bottom, there would be sort of an imbalance in the form. Whereas this echo of that shape at the top of the bottom really sort of kind of helps the form cohere. Another example of that is the bowl in the middle. This is Chinese from roughly the period of 1820 to 1850. And so here there's the kind of bell-like figure in the bowl of the pedestal bowl, which is echoed upside down in the foot, right? And so again here I think that visual echo really helps to sort of make the entire form cohere. And in an interesting way I would contrast that maybe with the candle holder that's shown on the extreme right, which is from northern Vietnam. And so there, I mean, you have many of these shapes where there's sort of like a sort of skirt. So at the very top, there's this skirted sort of shape, and the painted decoration on there is these series of panels. And then that shape is repeated upside down or right side up in the neck twice, and then on the very bottom, and on the bottom, the panels appear again. But here would be an example, I think, of the kind of idea where you have a visual rhyme which is occurring between very similar functional aspects of the piece. And so that would then, to me, be an example, again, of something that calls attention to that particular shape rather than contributing a distinctive thing to the overall impression of the form. And with that, I wanted to highlight another sort of connection to the way that we have formal analysis in literature, which is to just mention the term antinaclasis. And so antinaclasis, if you look up in Wikipedia, it's the stylistic scheme of repeating a single word or phrase, but with a different meaning, something that's often found in slogans. So the example that I have written up on there on the slide is something that's sometimes attributed to Benjamin Franklin, although there appears to be quite a bit of doubt about that. And the quote supposedly comes from the time of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, where it says, "We must indeed all hang together, or assuredly we shall all hang separately." Right, so hang being the repeated word, but meaning very different things. And there was I couldn't resist including a quote from that came from a recent issue of The Atlantic, where they're actually talking about political slogans from last summer from the Democratic Party. So I'm just going to read a bit of a quote of this article. It says, "On Monday, Democrats unveiled a new agenda, a better deal, better jobs, better wages, better future, that they hope will help them reclaim a majority in Congress." And then a reader commented on this saying, well, perhaps a better type of slogan would come from the following line. He says, "Americans on both sides of the aisle are tired of politicians helping their millionaire and billionaire buddies get richer, so perhaps the best slogan would be working for the working class." And I think in those two kinds of slogans, you again have an emphasis for this idea that in working for the working class, here's the word working being used in two different senses, and what it does is to really help the coherence of the slogan, right? It helps it feel like a meaningful, cogent, coherent principle. Whereas this other version, a better deal, better jobs, better wages, better future, right? There you're just using the same word over and over again in exactly the same meaning. And so that's something where what you remember about that slogan is just the word better. So in a similar way, it reinforces the sound rather than helping the meaning. So I also wanted to mention an essay by Roland Barthes called Rhetoric of the Image. So this can be found in an English translation by Stephen Heath in a book titled Image, Music, Text. And so there's a famous passage in here where generally Barthes here is trying to talk about rhetoric using ideas that again come from literary theory, but now applying it to images rather than applying it to texts. And the main idea in this particular essay is to focus attention on what he thinks of as functional images, and to him the functional image is an advertisement. Right, so in the image that's there on the right-hand side of the slide, so this is an advertisement for Panzani pasta. I guess this is a company making packaged goods for making spaghetti. And what Barthes talks about in this essay is to note that, well, you have lots of different symbols that are meant to invoke things in this advertisement. He notes that the dominant colors are red, white, and green. He notes that this advertising image was actually intended for a French viewing audience, and that simply the presence of those colors there would be something that would invoke for the French audience some concept kind of like Italianicity. So it's an attempt to have a sort of authenticity to these products. There's the placement together of these canned and packaged goods with fresh items in a market bag, so apparently fresh from the market. Right, so it invokes this sort of idea that these packaged goods are just as good as the fresh, authentic thing. Right, so you have all these different kinds of symbols that are embedded in there that are part of what the advertisement tries to get across. But mainly what he wants to say is that these individual signifiers, which on their own could kind of mean anything, right, when you bring them together into the structure of the advertisement, which is really what the function is, somehow that structure of the advertisement kind of pulls these different symbols together and tries to get them all working in the same direction to carry across a unified sort of message. And so to me, I would say I haven't really worked through this completely in my head, but I immediately think from those ideas to thinking about things like these Yixing sort of teapots by Richard Notkin, or let's say things like the cups that Aaron Toole makes, or things that are in the Democratic Cup Project, where here you would say that there are a number of individual symbols that are collected together into these functional objects. And again, it's something where the syntax of how these things come together, right, so what they generally in semiotics would call the syntame. The syntame is provided by the function of the piece, and then the individual symbols with their own connotations are set into it. And these might be things that would be really rather strange to have occurring together in some contexts, like the mushroom cloud, which is naturalized here by its role as the handle of the lid, and the dice that are down there, which I suppose is something about gambling with fate. That these can come together in the structure of the teapot in a much more, well, in a very natural way, because of the overall functional organization of the piece. Similarly, this idea of a naturalizing function of the functional syntame in these sorts of things like the cup, where the individual symbols there are symbols of things of war, but somehow their presence in a domestic context is really naturalized by the function of the cup as a domestic object that you drink from. And so to round out then this sort of just inventory of different kinds of linguistic rhetorical tropes that we can also note in ceramics, And kind of leading into the last thing that I wanted to talk about, there's a term that's metallipsis. And so if you look that up in Wikipedia, it says metellipsis is a figure of speech in which a word or a phrase from figurative speech is used in a new context. For example, I've got to catch the worm tomorrow. The idea being that there's an original figure of speech, which is the early bird catches the worm, but it's being used here in a kind of abbreviated or borrowed sort of context, just trying to mean that, oh, I have to get up early tomorrow. So if you look at the images here, on the left-hand side, we have these vases, which appear very Chinese in their decoration, but were actually made in the Meissen manufactory in 1733. And so these particular pieces, the way that they're painted, you can call out from there that the flowers that are represented are chrysanthemums and peonies. And in the original Chinese context, they have a sort of symbolism of their own, where, as I understand it, chrysanthemums were used to symbolize autumn and longevity, whereas peonies were typical symbols of royalty or virtue. But if you think about how they appear in this Western European piece, I think it's fair to say that they're just there to represent Chineseness, right? So it's again a kind of an indirect usage or a new usage of something that was already sort of symbolic and imagistic. Or on the right-hand side, if you look at this bowl by Shimaoka Tatsuzo, dated to about 1975, this is a very characteristic and well-known sort of decorative technique that Tatsuzo used, where there's a kind of a rope that's rolled across the surface to create an indented pattern, and then there's a kind of a slip inlay, right, which gives you this white patterning of that rope texture. And so this technique, of course, is actually a combination of two prior techniques that were used. That sort of cord rolling decoration is famous from much older Japanese jomon pottery, where it was just used simply as a technique of low relief. And then that sort of slip inlay is probably something we think of more in the context of Korean ceramics, of that sort of white slip inlay. But here's something where those two different techniques are now combined and borrowed to try to create something new out of them. And let's see, what's my next? That's maybe a good lead-in into the final topic that I wanted to talk about in the talk today, having to do with intertextuality and the anxiety of influence. And I should say, intertextuality is something that has been written about by many literary theorists. And in particular, I would point out Henry Louis Gates. Henry Louis Gates Jr. was written with great insight about intertextuality across cultures. And the applications of those sorts of ideas to ceramics could be the subject of a whole other lecture. But for the last couple of slides here, I actually wanted to focus more on some ideas of Harold Bloom, which are in a sense antithetical to those of Gates, but I include them because I feel that they may be quite relevant for thinking about the kind of ceramic work that I'm most closely engaged in, which is wood-fired ceramics with a sort of generalized East Asian aesthetic. So Bloom has written about these ideas mainly in a pair of books, and he takes some of these ideas really to an extreme. But he has this concept of the anxiety of influence, which basically says something like, as a poet writing in the modern era, there's a very typical cycle that the poet will go through, where he or she first gets attracted to the idea of becoming a poet by reading the classics or the ancients and encountering poetry of a much earlier era, and then is inspired to write poetry on himself or herself. And then initially, maybe there's a phase in which that person's writing is very imitative, really directly takes its cues from the earlier inspirational work, from the precursor, as Bloom says. Then there's an attempt or a feeling of a need to differentiate and do something new and innovative, which in some senses maybe almost sort of distorts the work. So this second quote that I've got on the slide there says, Milton, with all his strength, yet had to struggle subtly and crucially with a major precursor in Spenser, and this struggle both formed and malformed Milton. But then ideally, the way that this arc goes is that by the end of the poet's career, you maybe have a return to the original influence. And so that's this first longer quote where he says that the later poet holds his own poem so open again to the precursor's work that at first we might believe the wheel has come full circle and that we are back in the later poet's flooded apprenticeship before his strength began to assert itself in the revisionary ratios. But the poem is now held open to the precursor, whereas once it was open, and the uncanny effect is that the new poem's achievement makes it seem to us as though the later poet himself had written the precursor's characteristic work. So this kind of return to origins, which I'll talk about again in a second. But this idea, so Bloom would say things like basically all modern poetry is written in reaction to and defense against the influence of earlier works. And really taking it to an extreme, there's a short quote from his second book, A Map of Misreading, where he says, "Influence, as I conceive it, means that there are no texts, but only relationships between texts." So, if we were to carry that into a ceramic context, and I mainly think of this just from what I know of people working in a kind of Japanese tradition in wood firing, there's this overwhelmingly strong influence and inspiration from the Momoyama era Japanese works. And certain kinds of functional forms, if you think about something like a water jar, so the mizusashi, so the image on the very left is an actual Momoyama mizusashi, and it's just, it's iconic, right? I mean, it's just, that's the kind of thing that you think of when you think of a water jar. And now, working in this idiom in the 20th century and beyond, it's a natural kind of form to make. A lidded jar of about that size. And when you make a lidded jar of about that size, if you're doing wood-fired stoneware, you can't not reference the earlier Momoyama period work. And so I think you do see that in some cases you'll have attempts to both be inspired by those original forms or respond to those original forms, but really need to find a way to not just feel like you're copying them. And so Bloom, in his writing, thinks about tropes as a kind of psychological defense mechanism. So for example, you might think about examples of hyperbole, so in these two examples, with the examples that I've picked, I certainly don't mean to cast any aspersions on the artists represented here. They're two of my favorite artists. But the images just happen to represent this idea that a way to make a lidded jar that's stoneware and kind of has the same visual quality as the medieval Japanese ware, hyperbole is a thing that can help. So this exaggeration of the handle of the lid in this piece by Robert Turner, or another kind of hyperbole in terms of really accentuating the roughness of the surface finish and the way that the clay is treated that you see in this piece by Don Reitz. It's another thing which can clearly serve to differentiate and represent a form of innovation. And so it does strike me that a lot of what we are all doing in contemporary wood firing, it very much all happens in a mode of reaction to the earlier work. And very recently, I came across this great quote attributed to Ted Randall, but actually quoted by Josh Green in a recent NCICA blog post. So the quote by Ted Randall reads, "I have stopped trying for the pot that has never been seen before and continue to try for the pot that recalls all pottery. I keep looking for that degree of innovation that refurbishes, renews, connects to old meanings, allows the fun of invention, but looks back at the past with respect, understanding, and affection, opening the way for a continuous recreation of forms." And so, that for me is very much about what this last topic is about, that really coming to terms with the anxiety of influence and the extent to which maybe sometimes when we make work, really what we're trying to do is just avoid feeling like we're recreating old things, but then somehow finding a way to mature beyond that anxiety and finding the right kind of way to embrace that influence and not be afraid of it. That to me is something that is important for our work going forward. So just to conclude, I've run through this inventory of different examples of how we can kind of transfer analytic ideas about form from the literary context to talking about ceramics. But when I get done doing that, what I really feel like is, well, that was a fun exercise to do, but where does it really get us in terms of developing ceramics criticism? And I think the main thing that's really missing there is that ceramics is such a multi-sensory kind of art form. Like when I think about the two specific pieces that I discussed at the beginning of the talk, this Guinomi by Sayaka Shingu, the main things that appeal to me about it are the interaction between the visual qualities and the tactile and the haptic qualities, right? So somehow at the same time, this piece evokes things like flower petals and moth wings, but also really when you use it, invokes things like oysters, or the thorny parts of it also invoke things like sea urchins. It has this real tension between a kind of appearance of fragility and a feeling nonetheless of sort of being dangerous or tricky to use. Or in the Saketsugi by Takahara, I talked about the things it does for me in terms of invoking sacred space on the interior that is also a sort of down-in sort of sanctuarial kind of sacred space. And so that, again, has to do with an interaction of the the visual qualities of the piece, its kind of architectural character, and these feelings that you have when using it about like where you feel the coldness or the warmness of the piece against your hand. And so I think that in order to move beyond this and really develop this whole field of ceramic medium analysis, the main thing that we really need is more of a descriptive vocabulary for talking about these very evocative and elusive multisensory forms, and taking that forward into developing insightful formal analysis of the distinctive expressive modes of ceramics, where maybe we can start by being inspired by the ways that people have analyzed poetry, but really to talk about functional pots, there's a whole other dimension that we can try to explore, and maybe that's a good project for us.